After 10 years laying siege to the city of Troy, the clever king Odysseus spent even more years adrift on an endless expanse of sea, enduring all manner of dangers and distractions to make his way home. His little kingdom of Ithaca awaited him there in the land of Greece, and his sharp-witted wife Penelope, along with their son Telemachus, hardly of age when his father had left for war. There was a time in the course of this weary voyage when Odysseus and his crew arrived at an island, a green and pleasant-looking island, but one utterly unknown to them. Having just suffered through a barrage of violent storms at sea, the whole crew was relieved to set their eyes on a place to dock and rest, even if an air of mystery hung over the place, in waters uncharted by any of them. Even so, after Odysseus had already had his fill of perilous run-ins with giants, cannibals, and a rather unfriendly Cyclops, he couldn't help but have a bad feeling about what was coming next. Being cautious, the poor weather-worn voyagers kept quiet on the shore for 2 days, when they either stayed on board their ship or just crept along under cliffs that bordered the waves. To keep themselves alive, they dug shellfish out of the sand and searched for any bit of fresh water that might be running towards the sea. But before the 2 days were spent, they grew tired of this. Odysseus's crewmates were a restless bunch, understandably so, and by now their stock of provisions was exhausted. Even the shellfish were getting scarce, so now they had to choose between starving to death or venturing into the interior of the island, where, for all they knew, some 3-headed monster was waiting for its next meal. Given their luck on the voyage so far, they were trained to expect the worst of all scenarios. But their king Odysseus was not just clever, he was also bold. So on the 3rd morning, he determined to discover just what sort of a place the island was, and whether it was possible to obtain a supply of food for his companions' hungry mouths. So, taking a spear in his hand, he clambered to the summit of a cliff and gazed all around him. At a distance, towards the center of the island, he beheld the stately towers of what seemed to be a palace, built of snow-white marble, and rising in the midst of a grove of lofty trees. The thick branches of these trees stretched across the front of the edifice, and more than half concealed it, although, from the portion which he saw, Odysseus judged it to be spacious and incredibly beautiful, and probably the residence of some great ruler. A cloud of blue smoke went curling up from the chimney, and was almost the most pleasant part of the scene to the hungry Odysseus. He had visions of a good fire in the kitchen, and plentiful banquets served to whomever lived within. Perhaps some guests to the island would be offered their fill as well, assuming the hosts were civilized folk. On his way back to the shore to report this news, he had the good luck to kill a large stag with a skillful thrust of his spear. Taking it on his shoulders, the hero lugged it along with him, and flung it down before his hungry companions at the ship. When they saw the stag, they lost no time in kindling a fire out of driftwood to cook it, and the rest of the day was spent in happy feasting. But the next morning, their appetites were as sharp as ever. They looked at their leader, as if they expected him to climb up the cliff again and come back with another fat deer upon his shoulders. Instead of setting out, Odysseus gathered the whole crew together and told them it was unrealistic to hope that he could kill a stag every day for their dinner, and they should think of some other way to keep themselves fed. "Now listen here," he said. "When I was on the cliff yesterday, I discovered that this island is inhabited. At a far distance from here stood a marble palace, which looked huge and spacious, and smoke was blasting out of one of its chimneys." "Aha! muttered some of his crewmates, smacking their lips. "That smoke must have come from the kitchen. There must be good dinner on the spit, the more for all of us." Nevertheless, they hesitated at the thought of the dangers that might await them. The memory of the Cyclops was still fresh in their minds when they ended up becoming the meal instead of eating one. But they also saw there was no other choice if they wanted to survive. "Here's my plan," Odysseus went on. "Let's divide ourselves into 2 equal parties and draw lots to see which of the 2 will go to the palace and ask for food and assistance. If they succeed, then all is well. But if not, then only half of us run the risk of danger, and the rest can set sail and escape." When nobody objected to this, Odysseus proceeded to count the whole band, and found that there were 46, including himself. So he numbered off 22 of them, and put Eurylochus in charge of them, one of his chief officers. Odysseus took command of the remaining 22 himself. Taking off his helmet, he put 2 shells into it, on one of which was written the word "Go," and on the other, "Stay." Another person held the helmet, while Odysseus and Eurylochus each blindly picked out a shell. And it was Eurylochus who got the word "Go." It was decided that Odysseus and his 22 men would remain at the seaside until the other party found out what sort of treatment awaited them at the mysterious palace. There was no sense in waiting, and Eurylochus immediately set out at the head of his 22 followers. Neither party left the other in high spirits. They had run into too many misfortunes for optimism. No sooner had they climbed up the cliff than they viewed in the distance the tall marble towers of the palace, ascending as white as snow out of the deep green shadow of the trees that surrounded it. The party went onward through the woods, every now and then still catching new glimpses of the gleaming marble, which looked more and more beautiful the nearer they approached it. They soon entered a broad pathway, which seemed very neatly kept, and went winding along with streaks of sunshine falling across it, and specks of light quivering among the deep shadows that fell from the tall trees. It was bordered, too, with a great many sweet-smelling flowers, such as the sailors had never seen before. Such a lovely spot could rival the Isles of the Blessed, and hardly seemed possible on this empty island. Finally, they came within full sight of the palace, which up close was every bit as large and lofty as it appeared from far away, with several airy pinnacles upon its roof. Though it was now midday, and the sun shone brightly over the marble front, its gleaming stone and its fantastic style of architecture made it look unreal, like the frostwork on a window pane, or like the shapes of castles one sees among moonlit clouds. But just then, a puff of wind brought down the smoke of the kitchen chimney among them, and caused each man to smell the food he liked best. They hastened their steps toward the gates, but had not gotten halfway across the wide lawn when a pack of lions, tigers, and wolves came bounding out to meet them. The terrified crew started back, fully expecting to be torn to pieces. But to their surprise and joy, these fearsome beasts only played around them, wagging their tails, offering their heads to be petted, as if they were happy to meet their master's friends. The biggest lion licked the feet of Eurylochus, and every other lion and every wolf and tiger singled out one of his 22 followers for love and attention. For all that, Eurylochus imagined that he saw something fierce and savage in their eyes, and he wouldn't have been surprised at any moment to feel the big lion's terrible claws, or to see each of the tigers make a deadly spring, or each wolf leap at their throats. Their mildness seemed unreal. Their savage nature was as true as their teeth and claws. But Odysseus's men went safely across the lawn, with the wild beasts playing about them, and doing no harm. Eurylochus and his followers now passed under a lofty gate, and looked through the open doorway into the interior of the palace. The first thing that they saw was a large hall, and a fountain in the middle of it, gushing up towards the ceiling out of a marble basin, and falling back into it with a continual plash. Before the strangers had time to look closely at this wonderful sight, their attention was drawn off by a very sweet and agreeable sound. A woman's voice was singing melodiously in another room of the palace, and with her voice was mingled the noise of a loom at which she was probably seated, weaving a rich texture of cloth, and intertwining the high and low sweetness of her voice into a rich tissue of harmony. By and by, the song came to an end, and then, all at once, there were several feminine voices, talking airily and cheerfully, with now and then a happy burst of laughter. "What a sweet song that was!" exclaimed one of the voyagers. "Too sweet, indeed," answered Eurylochus, shaking his head, remembering their brush at sea with the deadly sirens. "But just listen to the pleasant voices of those maidens, and that buzz of the loom as the shuttle passes to and fro," said another comrade. "What a home-like sound it is. Ah, before that endless siege of Troy, I used to hear the loom and the women's voices under my own roof." Eurylochus kept urging caution, but no warning or persuasion had any effect on his companions. They went up to a pair of double doors at the farther end of the hall, and throwing them wide open, passed into the next room. Eurylochus, meanwhile, had stepped off behind a pillar. In the short moment while the double doors opened and closed again, he caught a glimpse of a very beautiful woman rising from the loom and coming to meet the poor weather-beaten wanderers with a hospitable smile, and her hand stretched out in welcome. There were 4 other young women who joined their hands and danced merrily forward. They were only less beautiful than the lady who seemed to be their mistress. Yet Eurylochus, from afar, thought that one of them had sea-green hair, and that the close-fitting bodice of a second looked like the bark of a tree, and that both the others had something odd in their aspect, although he couldn't determine what it was in the little time he had to study them. The double doors swung quickly back, and left him standing behind the pillar in the solitude of the outer hall. There Eurylochus waited until he was quite tired, and listened eagerly to every sound, but without hearing anything that could help him to guess what had become of his friends. Footsteps seemed to be passing and repassing in other parts of the palace. There was a clatter of dishes, which made him imagine a rich feast in a splendid feasting hall. But then, the next noise he heard was a tremendous grunting and squealing, and then a sudden scampering, like dozens of small, hard hooves over a marble floor, while the voices of the mistress and her 4 handmaidens were screaming out all together. Eurylochus could not imagine what had happened, unless a drove of pigs had broken into the palace. The door of the chamber was suddenly flung open, and a rush of pigs ran in all directions. They found their way to the pigsties, biting and snorting at one another, putting their feet in the trough and gobbling up their scraps. Eurylochus watched everything with shock and amazement, and fear at what had happened to his friends. Back inside the room, he caught a look at the lady of the palace, wielding a slender wand, with a mischievous look in her eye. He decided to hurry back to Odysseus, and raced as fast as he could down the steps, away from the palace grounds, and never stopped to draw breath until he had made it to the shore. "Eurylochus, why are you alone?" asked Odysseus as soon as he saw him coming. "Where are the other 22? At these questions, Eurylochus burst into tears. "My king!" he cried, visibly shaken. "I'm afraid we'll never see any of their faces again." Then he told Odysseus all that had happened, as far as he could tell it, and added his own suspicions, that the beautiful woman was an evil sorceress, and the marble palace, magnificent as it looked, was only a trap. As for his comrades, he couldn't imagine what had become of them, unless they had been given to the pigs to be devoured alive. At this news, all the voyagers were terrified. But Odysseus lost no time in strapping on his sword and hanging his bow and quiver over his shoulders, and taking his spear in his right hand. "Stay here and wait for me here until tomorrow," Odysseus commanded the others. "If I don't return by then, hoist sail and find your way to our native land. I will either bring back our men with me, or die here on this island." And with that, he set out from their camp. Odysseus had no time to waste in solving this mystery, and quickened his pace. When he had gone a far way along the wooded path, there appeared on the horizon another traveler on the road. He was young, quick, and intelligent-looking, and dressed in unusual garb. He wore a short cloak, and a sort of cap that seemed to be furnished with a pair of wings, and from the lightness of his step, you would think there might be wings on his sandals, too. He carried a winged staff, around which 2 sculpted serpents were twined. Odysseus was well known among the Olympian gods, and he knew how to recognize one of them in an instant. It was Hermes who met him now, on the move once again in his endless travels. "Where are you going in such a hurry, wise Odysseus?" asked Hermes. "Don't you know that this is a magical island? An enchantress is the queen of this place. Her name is Circe, and she dwells in the marble palace you see through the trees. By her magic arts, she changes every human being who finds her into the beast or bird they happen to look like the most." "And my crew?" inquired Odysseus. "Is that what's happened to them through the sorcery of this wicked Circe? Can I do nothing to help them?" "It will require all your wisdom," said Hermes, "and a little of my own into the bargain. Do as I tell you, and this might all end better than it's begun." While he was speaking, Hermes seemed to be in search of something. He went stooping along the ground, and soon laid his hand on a little plant with a snow-white flower, which he plucked and held up to his nose to smell. Odysseus had been looking at that very spot only just before, and it seemed to him that the plant had burst into full flower the instant Hermes had touched it with his fingers. "Take this flower, which we immortals call moly," said the god. "Guard it well, for I can assure you it is exceedingly rare and precious, and you might seek the whole earth over without ever finding another like it. Keep it in your hand, and smell it frequently after you enter the palace, and while you're talking with the enchantress, especially when she offers you food or a drink of wine out of her goblet. Be careful to fill your nostrils with the flower's fragrance. Follow these directions, and you may defy her magic arts." After listening attentively, Odysseus thanked his good friend, and resumed his way. But he had taken only a few steps when, remembering some other questions he wished to ask, he turned around again, and beheld nobody on the spot where Hermes had stood, for that winged cap of his and those winged sandals, with the help of the winged staff, had carried him quickly out of sight. When Odysseus reached the lawn in front of the palace, the lions and other savage animals came bounding to meet him, and they would have fawned upon him and licked his feet as they had done for his crewmates. But the wise king struck at them with his long spear, and demanded them be gone out of his path, for he knew now that they had once been men, bloodthirsty men, and would tear him limb from limb if they acted on their true nature. The wild beasts glared at him and stood at a distance while he ascended the palace steps. On entering the hall, he heard the noise of the shuttle in the loom and the sweet melody of the woman's song, and then the pleasant voices of herself and the four maidens talking together, with peals of laughter intermixed. But Odysseus did not waste time in listening to the laughter or the song. He leaned his spear against one of the pillars of the hall, and then, after loosening his sword in the scabbard, stepped boldly forward and threw the double doors wide open. The moment she beheld his stately figure standing in the doorway, the beautiful woman rose from the loom and ran to meet him with a glad smile and both her hands extended. "Welcome, brave stranger," she cried. "We were expecting you." And the nymph with the sea-green hair made a curtsy down to the ground, and likewise did her three sisters. Circe, as the beautiful witch was called, again addressed him. "Your companions have already been received into my palace, and have enjoyed the hospitable treatment they deserved. If you'd like, you can enjoy some refreshment yourself, and then go join them in the elegant homes they have now. Judging by your look, I take you to be nothing less than a king. Please deign to follow me, and you shall be treated here with all the respect a king deserves." So Odysseus followed her into the banquet chamber, where his 22 comrades had last been seen, at least in human form. But all this while, he had held the snow-white flower in his hand, and had constantly smelled its fragrance while Circe was speaking. And as he crossed the threshold of the dining room, he took several more long snuffs of its fragrance. The enchantress took Odysseus by the hand and made him sit down upon a dazzling throne. This was surely the most magnificent seat that ever a king had rested upon, all made of chased gold, studded with precious stones, with a cushion that looked like a soft heap of living roses. Then, clapping her hands, the sorceress summoned the food and drink. Wine was brought, and the royal goblet hastily filled with a liquid as bright as gold. But, delightful as the wine looked, it was mingled with the most potent enchantments that Circe knew how to concoct. For every drop of the pure grape, there were 2 drops of pure magic. The mere smell of the bubbles, which bubbled at the brim, was enough to turn a man's beard into pig's bristles, or make a lion's claws grow from his fingers, or a fox's tail brush behind him. "Drink, my noble guest," said Circe, smiling as she presented him with the cup. "You will find in this a comfort for all your troubles." Odysseus took the goblet with his right hand, while, with his left, he held the snow-white flower to his nostrils, and drew in a breath so deep that his lungs were filled with its clean fragrance. Then, drinking off all the wine, he looked the enchantress calmly in the face. At this, the whole mood of the encounter shifted dramatically. Confident that the trap had been sprung, Circe lashed out, brandishing her wand. "You wretch!" cried Circe, striking him with it. "How dare you keep your human shape a moment longer? Take the form of the beast you most resemble. If you're a pig, go join your fellow swine in the sty. If you're a lion, a wolf, a tiger, go howl with the wild beasts on the lawn. If you're a fox, go steal some poultry. You've drunk my wine, so be human no more." But such was the power of the snow-white Moly, that instead of wallowing down from his throne in animal form, Odysseus looked even more kingly than ever before. He gave the magic goblet a toss, and sent it clashing over the marble floor to the farthest end of the chamber. Then, drawing his sword, he made ready to strike off her head with one blow. "Wicked Circe," he shouted in a terrible voice, "this sword shall put an end to your sorcery. You shall die, and do no more evil to my crew." Odysseus's tone and expression were so fearsome, his sword gleamed so brightly and seemed so sharp, that Circe was almost killed by the mere fright, without waiting for a blow. "Spare me," cried the enchantress. "Spare me, royal and wise Odysseus, for now I know that you were the one Hermes forewarned me about, the most clever of mortals, whom no spell can defeat. I will show you true hospitality, and this magnificent palace can be your home." Odysseus wouldn't stay his hand until Circe had taken a solemn oath to change back his companions to their former shapes of men. Circe agreed, and led Odysseus out of the back entrance of the palace and showed him the pigs in their sty. There were about 50 of these unclean beasts in the whole herd, but when he approached the sty, 22 enormous swine separated themselves from the herd and scampered towards him with a chorus of excited squeals. "Well," Odysseus laughed darkly, "they're just as clean and put together as when I left them last." And he turned to Circe forcefully. "See it done now, Lady of the Island, if your magic is equal to the task. It might not be a big improvement, but make them men again." Circe assented, waved her wand again, and repeated a few magic words, at the sound of which the 22 hogs pricked up their hanging ears. It was a wonder to behold how their snouts grew shorter and shorter, and their mouths smaller and smaller, and how one and then another began to stand upon his hind legs and scratch his nose with his forelegs. Finally, there stood the 22 comrades of Odysseus, fully human, but slathered in thick mud. "Our thanks to you, noble Odysseus," they cried. If one listened closely, there was still a suspicious grunt and squeal in their voices, and from force of habit, some still picked up acorns off the ground to chew with a mindlessly contented look. And so, when everything was settled, Odysseus sent some of them to bring the rest of their crew, whom they had left at the seashore. When everyone arrived, with the still cautious Eurylochus at their head, they made themselves at home in Circe's enchanted palace until they were rested from the toils and hardships of their voyage. In the end, the witch had become an ally, and would advise the wandering Odysseus on his next steps in the journey home, a voyage that would take him all the way to the realm of the dead. But that is a tale for another time. Welcome all to the Behind the Story commentary on the tale of Odysseus and Circe. So with this story we're taken to the world of the Odyssey, and one of the most famous episodes in it. Circe is a really fascinating character, and in the last 2.5 millennia or so, since the Odyssey came together, she has inspired a lot of retellings of her story and artworks that try to capture her sort of alluring power. And in fact, there's the recent novel called Circe by Madeline Miller that takes some cues from the ancient myth and weaves a new story about her life among the gods and mortals. It's a really great example of how myths like this are still being adapted and reimagined in all different ways to speak to different times and audiences. So, the account in Odyssey Book 10 is the most famous of the tales of Circe in the ancient world, and became sort of the standard version of her character. But she makes the rounds outside the Odyssey too. She's mentioned toward the end of the poet Hesiod's work Theogony, about the origins of the gods, where Circe shows up in a catalogue of the genealogies of different heroes, and she's the child of the sun god Helios. In the later epic poem by Apollonius of Rhodes, about the voyage of the Argonauts, she shows up there again, where they visit her on the way back home from their journey to get the Golden Fleece. And even in Virgil's Roman epic poem, the Aeneid, Circe is alluded to in a few different ways during the story, which makes sense since Aeneas' journey to Italy is modeled really closely after Odysseus' journey to Ithaca in the Odyssey. And speaking of Roman poets, we also have to mention Ovid's Metamorphoses, a work entirely about the transformation of people into other things, including animals, in this large compendium of myths. So her magical powers fit perfectly there, and Ovid has a really fun version of the Circe story. In terms of her career as a sorceress, she's one of a number of witches who pop up in Greek mythology, probably the other most famous one being Medea, star of her own Wine Dark Sea video, who also gets involved with Jason and the Argonauts. And as a matter of fact, Medea and Circe are related to each other, since Medea's family is also descended from the sun god, Helios, making Circe Medea's aunt, and Medea's father Aeetes was Circe's brother. And Circe's mystical island of Aiaia, by the way, was supposed to have been on the west coast of central Italy somewhere. Ancient commentators enjoyed trying to map out the real-world locations where Odysseus' fantastical voyages happened, so the island of Sardinia was one location they proposed, or even closer to the peninsula itself, a cape that juts out that's still called Monte Circeo today, after Circe. That's Circe's mountain in Italian. Now, let's talk a bit more about Circe's role specifically in the Odyssey. If you remember the story in the original poem, she's one of a sequence of female characters Odysseus encounters along the way home. And what's interesting about these encounters, in the way that story is told, is how tightly connected they are to the main plot of the story. And Circe's a great example of this. So, of course, the main goal of Odysseus in the epic is to return home, from the Trojan War back to his home of Ithaca, and he wants to reunite with his family. His son Telemachus and his wife Penelope, they've both been longing for him to come back all these years. But he encounters Calypso, a nymph, and he stays with her for years, although not completely willingly, at least in the end. There's also Nausicaa, a young princess of the island he gets to after leaving Calypso. And Circe gets her story told through the words of Odysseus when he recounts all his journeying to Nausicaa's parents, the king and queen. Now, all these encounters with other women are presented in their own way as hints at another life Odysseus might have led if he had stopped going home and instead just settled down where he was. These encounters offer alternative homes and even alternative wives to his real wife Penelope. The Princess Nausicaa's home is a peaceful, good place, and she herself seems to develop a bit of a crush on him, though nothing's going to come of that. With Calypso and Circe both, though, Odysseus obviously gets very involved with both of them, and the way the relationships are described between these two women and Odysseus is very domestic. It evokes a household, and these two figures almost represent surrogate wives for him. Calypso is pretty explicitly described as a kind of wifely figure. But Odysseus is going to stay the course and get back to his true home and the true love of his life. And yet these encounters offer up an interesting scenario as we watch his story unfold in the epic of, the road not taken. Speaking of Circe and Odysseus getting involved after they make peace with each other, there were versions of the story where they actually have children, too. And interestingly, this one is recorded in those genealogies in Hesiod's Theogony, too, where Circe shows up. One of these children is King Latinus, a legendary king of central Italy, in the region where Rome is going to be one day. This guy, Latinus, is the one who, according to the legends, gives his name to the region of Latium, nowadays Lazio. And of course, the Latin language that's spoken there, too, is named after Latinus. So he's a big character in the Aeneid, especially, which deals with the founding of Rome. And besides Latinus, there are other versions of the Circe and Odysseus story that have another child of those two named Telegonus, who grows up after Odysseus has long since sailed away from Aiaia, and then he actually goes to hunt down his father. And in some versions of the story, Telegonus ends up killing Odysseus several years down the road. He's the one that does him in. And this is a son Odysseus had with Circe. So there are more consequences from this relationship in the broader mythology around Circe and Odysseus. One more thing to note about Circe is how she relates to ancient conceptions of gender, especially when it comes to female power. So the ancient Greeks and Romans had fun with scary stories about witches just as much as we do today. But the sort of mythologized figure of the deadly sorceress really didn't stop with these stories. It extended into historical stereotypes about women as well. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that ancient ideas around female power, particularly discomfort around female power as something unnatural or against the order of things, is reflected in these scary female sorceresses of the imagination, like Medea and Circe. It's really not uncommon to find historical examples of ancient writers, and these are predominantly male authors, characterizing powerful women in politics, for instance, as having magical powers. And these are women like queens, empresses, and so on. The stereotypes are always there. Just like Circe, they rely on trickery and cunning, and they use poison as their sneaky weapon, just like how Circe gives Odysseus the chalice in this story. In ancient Athens, you have Aspasia, who was the partner of Pericles, the major democratic leader of the 5th century. She's accused of witchcraft and disrespect of the gods. This was a totally baseless charge for Aspasia, but it was kind of par for the course for a lot of the criticism that she attracted in her own time. There was a lot of sort of conspiracy theorizing going on, that she was the power behind Pericles, and she was sort of controlling Athenian politics from the shadows. There are lots of Roman examples of this too, like Livia, the Emperor Augustus's wife, who was characterized as this sort of scheming, evil poisoner in the work of a lot of later historians like Tacitus, without, again, too much basis for those charges to go on. An even better example from Roman times is Cleopatra, who is said to have bewitched Mark Antony, the Roman general that she married, and she made him betray Rome because he was under her spell. This is a pattern that you see a lot when a woman exercises unique agency in otherwise male-dominated spheres, like politics, especially politics. So to bring this back to Circe, as a female with mysterious magical abilities, she seems to exemplify this kind of discomfort with feminine control or power, and the image of this mythological sorceress who took advantage of men and bent them to her will resonates a lot with the way figures like Aspasia or Cleopatra or Livia in real life were sort of imagined or caricatured by their enemies as dangerous, cunning witches. Okay, and that's all on Circe. Thank you all very much for listening, and as always, if you have any further questions or points to make about the story, then you're very welcome and encouraged to drop me a line on this platform. Thank you very much for your support of Wine Dark Sea, and we'll see you in the next one. Enjoy the rest of your day, and remember that pigs are people too, at least in this story.